Here we come.
Good morning. Yes, Ezekiel, here we come. We are starting a whole new class this morning, a whole new book of the Bible. We're starting the book of Ezekiel, and this is class number 1. And this morning we're only going to do 3 verses because primarily what we're going to be doing is an introduction into the book of Ezekiel so you can understand who he was, what his ministry was, how he was called, and you can understand some things about what was going on in the world at that time and what was going on in Judah at that time and what was going on with the various prophets around. This was the major, most important period of prophecy in the entire Bible, was the period that we're going to be covering here as we go through this. And so there's a lot going on in the world at that time, and we're going to be studying all of that today, and we're going to look at the structure of Ezekiel as well. Ezekiel is uniquely structured among all the books of the Bible, so we're going to look at that today as well. Next week we'll actually begin getting into the details of it as we look at how Ezekiel was called. Let's start, as I always start, with what his name means in Hebrew. And Hebrew is an interesting language because almost every Jew has a name that is put together from various Hebrew root words and that has a meaning. And in his name, it comes from 2 Hebrew words, Hezek and L. We all know that L means God in Hebrew. L is, we've talked about that a lot of times in my classes. So this has something to do with God. And Hezek means to strengthen. So Ezekiel means strengthened by God. And as we're going to talk about, the people at that time had, at the time that Ezekiel was prophesying, King Josiah, the good king, had just passed away, and the kings who came along behind him were very, very evil. So you had evil kings in Israel, or Judah, and Judah again slipped deeply into sin, deeply into idolatry and child sacrifice and all these horrible, horrible things. So God needed them to know that they were about to be punished for that. And he raised up a couple of prophets to do that. He raised up Jeremiah and he raised up Ezekiel to do that. He also raised up Zephaniah, who we just finished studying, to do that. And their job was to tell the Jews, here's what's about to happen, and to give it to them very, very straight. And God wanted Ezekiel and Jeremiah in particular to really pull no punches, just lay it out there, give it to them exactly as it's going to be. And to do that, he really had to strengthen them. And we're not going to study Jeremiah here, but he did Jeremiah in a different way. But we're going to study over the next few weeks how he strengthened Ezekiel to get him ready for his ministry. And God does this in general with people. It took, Jesus didn't start his ministry till he was 30, and then he spent 40 days in the wilderness getting ready for that, right? Moses didn't go to Egypt until he was 80, and he spent 40 years in the wilderness getting ready for it. The various disciples came from, at other points in their lives. They grew up in other things, doing other things, fisherman, tax collector. One of them was even a revolutionary. They did all these things to get ready for what God, the plan that God had for them. The same thing's true here. Ezekiel, God had a plan for Ezekiel, but Ezekiel had to get ready for that, and God was going to prepare him, and we're going to see how God will prepare him for that. But God wanted him to just lay it out there, just hit him right between the eyeballs with what was about to happen. And as we read how Ezekiel words it, or how God words it to Ezekiel, and then Ezekiel gives it to the people, it is tough stuff, right from the eyeballs, right between the eyeballs that God is giving them. What was coming on Judah was extremely bad, and God wanted to make sure that Ezekiel gave them a clear understanding of what was coming if they didn't repent. And he knew by this point that they weren't going to repent. So the people of Judah were deeply in sin. How do you think they responded to a message if they loved their sin and somebody comes in as a prophet and says, you've got to stop this, and if you don't, here's all the horrible things that are going to happen?
Just like America right now.
Right. They probably said, let's shoot him, right? Yeah, so they weren't very happy about it. The kings didn't want to hear about it. They were leading this whole mess. The princes didn't want to hear about it. Most of the other prophets just fell in line behind the evil that was going on, and they went ahead and prophesied evil stuff. Most of the priests were involved in actually being priests of other gods in that time, not of our God. So the people of Israel or of Judah did not want to hear this, and they obviously didn't react well to that with Judah. As we saw when we looked at Jeremiah, they actually did all kinds of stuff to Jeremiah as well. So the people hated Jeremiah and Ezekiel for doing this, for giving them the truth from God. It was not well received, but it needed to be given, and God raised Ezekiel up to do that. And sometimes we have to do that in our world. Sometimes we have to tell people things that they don't want to hear. So in the Bible, there were 4 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Isaiah was quite a bit earlier. He was 100 and some years before these other guys. But Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel were all at the same time. Very interesting. So God raises up 4 major prophets in the entire Bible, and he puts 3 of them at the same time, the time that we're about to study here in this class. So why does he do that? By the way, Zephaniah is at this time as well. Zephaniah is a minor prophet, but 4 prophets are all raised up at the same time. We just finished studying Zephaniah. So God raises up all of this prophecy power right at the same time. We're going to find out why as we go through this class. Why did God do that at this particular time? Why was this time so important to Judah and to us today as we're studying it? So we're going to be studying this time, one of the most critical times in the Bible, over the next however many weeks while we're studying Ezekiel. We don't know for sure, but it sounds like Ezekiel was kind of a loner. If everybody hates you, it's probably not difficult to be a loner, right? And everybody seemed to hate him for what he was doing and what he was saying. Now, let's start by looking at each of the three that were active at this time. I'm going to start by looking at Daniel, and then I'm going to look at Jeremiah, and then I'm going to look at Ezekiel last, since Ezekiel's where we're going in this class. So let's look at what was happening with Daniel at that time. And I've got a timeline up here. And I'm going to be, I put it in chronological order because my brain thinks in chronological order, as Deb well knows. I have a chronological memory. So my brain thinks of everything in chronological order. But as we go through it, I'm going to show it to you in a little bit different order. So let's start with Daniel. And first of all, Daniel is born in about 621 BC. So he's born at a time when this is already well underway. And Daniel ends up going to Babylon in 605 BC. So he's 16 years old when he goes to Babylon, and he gets captured. At that point, the Babylonian king comes in, takes over Jerusalem, and takes the king out and takes him as a hostage and sends him to Israel. To Babylon, and then takes out a whole bunch of the royal family and sends them off as hostages to Babylon. The reason is he wants Jerusalem to be a puppet government for him. He wants Jerusalem to stay loyal to him, to be obedient to him. And so he takes a lot of the royal family. Daniel was in the royal family. Daniel was of royal blood. So Daniel was of noble blood. So Daniel goes off to Babylon with the king and the first group of captives to go to Babylon. And very quickly, Daniel becomes a leader in Babylon. Even at the age of 16, Daniel begins to lead. He kind of defies the king about something and ends up in front of the king, and it has to do with food. And I'm not going to get into that whole story today, but Daniel manages to present himself to the king and the leaders of the court in Babylon as being exceptional. And pretty soon they bring him in, and then Daniel helps the king interpret a dream. And all of a sudden, Daniel rises from just being an exceptional guy who's serving in the court to being the king's primary advisor during this period. Daniel was the primary advisor to the king pretty quickly. So Daniel was the leader of the Jews, and he was the primary advisor of the king. So the Jews did well in Babylon while they were there. They thought when they went there that they were going to be put into slavery, and it really didn't happen. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But they really didn't end up in slavery. They really ended up doing well, largely because Daniel did well with the king. And the king liked Daniel. And Daniel never gave up his principles. He was a wonderful guy. But God helped him to do well with the king of Babylon. So Daniel was the leader of the Jews while they were in exile. Let me see what else I left out here. Oh, Daniel died somewhere around 535 BC. We know that Daniel was there on the night that Babylon fell, and that was in 535 BC. And then he's never heard from again. So by that point, he would have been way up in his late 80s, probably about 88 years old. So we're guessing Daniel died right after that in 535 BC. So that's this one down here. And that, by the way, was the year when the Jews were allowed to return. When the Persians came in and conquered Babylon in 535 BC, they allowed the Jews to go back. So that was the point where Daniel's ministry was done. So that was Daniel. He was there at that time. He was the leader of the Jews in Jerusalem. Let's talk about Jeremiah next. Now, Jeremiah started his prophecy in about 627 BC. Let me use a different color here. Dee will be happy if I use more colors. So Daniel is blue. Jeremiah is going to be red.
It should be Jeremiah that's blue.
Huh?
Jeremiah should be blue.
Why?
Because Lamentation.
Okay.
Okay, no.
Thank you, Stephen. I love you, Stephen. Thanks.
There's one in every class.
Yeah.
Actually, I love questions. And when Stephen comes to the class, I get more questions than I do any other time. I love questions, so thank you.
That's always the one.
So Jeremiah comes in 627 BC, and Jeremiah never actually leaves Jerusalem. During all of this stuff, he stays in Jerusalem through the whole thing, and he just keeps telling the Jews, here's how bad it's going to be if you don't repent. And of course they don't repent, so eventually he ends up, having to put up with the fact that they didn't repent.
What did you refer to as a weeping prophet too? Because they rejected him so much, but is he the one that was called the weeping prophet?
Well, he wrote Lamentations.
Oh, that's
And
right.
Lamentations appears to have been written on the day that Jerusalem fell.
Okay.
And I have a mental picture of him sitting on the Mount of Olives, watching all this death and mayhem going on, and writing Lamentations. That's my mental picture of it, but that's something like that is what happened. And yes, he was weeping over Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't listen to him, and now they're paying the price. So at any rate, he was here through this whole time. He stayed in Jerusalem the whole time. And we think he dies in about 580 BC. We don't have an exact year. We think he leaves Jerusalem in 586 because the Babylonians threw all the Jews out of Israel at that point. We think he goes to Egypt, and we think he dies in Egypt in about 580. So that's Jeremiah. He was an active prophet during this period. Yeah.
I'm assuming they had a calendar in 580 BC.
They did. We're going to talk about that. Yes.
Okay. So I was wondering,
there's actually
what year did they record that? Because they have no clue when Christ is coming.
Right.
So they would never record it as 580 BC.
The Bible records things really interesting, especially if you go back through the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. They record things in terms of the kings and the year of that king's reign. Mm-hmm. So let's say we're looking at King Josiah. A prophet might say, in the 4th year of King Josiah's reign, and then it'll go on to say, in the 3rd month and the 12th day. While the 3rd month will be the Hebrew months of the year, and there were 12 months in most years, 13 in some others. It's kind of a weird calendar. And then the days were, and they were lunar months. They were from new moon to new moon, not like months today. Like this month, we just had a blue moon. That meant 2 full moons in the same month, right? Yeah. So you couldn't. That didn't happen in Israel. In Israel, a month was exactly the cycle of a moon. And there aren't exactly 12 of those in a year. It's 12 point something of them. So the result is some years you have 12 months and some years you have 13 months. I think it's, if I remember the Jewish calendar, I think it's 12 out of every 19 years you have 12 months, and 7 out of every 19 years you have 13 months in the Jewish year.
The Muslims have the same thing, the lunar system.
Yeah, we have what we call a sol lunar calendar today, which means sol is sun, so it's primarily sun oriented, and lunar is moon. They had a lun-solar calendar, so it was primarily moon oriented, and the secondary thing was the sun. So their calendar was based primarily on the moon in those days. Did I answer your question?
But BC is retro, is
Oh.
kind of after.
Yeah, so how do we find the exact date? If we know it was in such and such
So
year.
they start a calendar in the year 2000, when,
Yeah. Obviously, the calendar that we use started with Jesus.
Correct.
BC is before Christ, AD is Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. So it started at the birth of Jesus. In theory, it was probably a couple of years off, but in theory, it started then. Back then, they kept time in terms of the years of the king's reigns. That's how every civilization kept time that way. It was, in the year of Pharaoh so-and-so, the 14th year, boom. So that's how they kept
it's not
calendars.
2023,
So what we have to do is go back and figure out how each of those different rulers interfaced with other rulers. A lot of people have spent a lot of time doing that over the years. Based on that, they can figure out the actual dates in BC of when things happened.
But actually, the Jewish calendar, this is the year 5783.
Yeah.
So they don't go, back then they didn't use our calendar, which is be 2023.
Yes, but they didn't. In the Bible, they don't ever use those actual numbers.
Right.
You're correct. Today, the Jewish calendar is dated back to Adam's neshama. We talked about this in a previous class, to the point where Adam received his soul from God, and that's in Genesis 1:27. So everything dates from that moment in the Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar today does it that way, but the Jewish calendar wasn't really used in the Bible that way. So in the Bible, they did it based on the kings. And as long as you know that this king existed when that Pharaoh existed, who existed when that emperor existed, as long as you know the different years of how those all interrelate, which you do, because there's enough archaeology to back that up, then you can back into the exact year.
Sure.
Okay.
And there are charts that compares all of these to get the Mesopotamian,
Right.
Romans and the Greek and.
Let me give you an example. When Deb and I were in Israel in 2014, they were just doing archaeological dig at a big mound outside of Jerusalem. Turns out we went back in 2014, they had discovered that was the tomb of King Herod. And inside they found archaeological evidence that he died on, I think it was July 5th of 4 BC. So, they were able to put that to the emperor's reign in Rome, and we know the emperors pretty well, so that they were able to put that, they based it in terms of the emperor would have been Augustus at that point in Rome, that it was in the so-and-so year of his reign and such. Based on that, we now have a pretty good understanding, since Herod was alive when Jesus was alive, we know that Jesus probably was born before the year 0, right? He was probably born a couple of years earlier. So that's something we didn't know until 2014. That's new news archaeology has dug up in recent years. Things like that happen that help us really fine-tune the calendar over time. Okay.
So when they,
Oh, go ahead.
so when they have these archaeological digs and they find a tomb, what do they put? Any kind of do they put then? King Herod died in the year of. They're not going to say.
They'll say King Herod died
is
in the.
Is there any kind of engraving on it that dates it, or?
Yeah, there's always stuff like that in these tombs that'll date it.
Okay, but it's not going to say BC. It's going to say
not always, no.
the year of.
In the year of
whatever
Augustus
reign.
Caesar's reign, year number 14, on the such and such
Oh, and
date.
then it can be-
That's how they did
okay.
it back then. Yeah.
This one, where is Nehemiah related to all of this? 'Cause I think
Nehemiah?
from Persia. in
Nehemiah-
the exile, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, Nehemiah actually comes.
Later on, okay.
In 535 BC, the Jews begin to come back, and they come back in 3 waves. They begin to come back to Jerusalem from Persia. The first wave is led by Zerubbabel and Joshua, those two, and also by Haggai. Haggai the prophet. So the 3 of them lead the first wave in 535. The second wave comes back, I think, in 5 or 10 years later, something like that. The second wave comes back. That's where Ezra comes back in that wave. The third wave comes back in the 470s, I think. That's quite a few years later, and that's when Nehemiah comes.
Okay.
So Nehemiah is probably in the early 400s, 470, 480, somewhere in that range. He comes back. And he really brought the temple worship up to full specs when he came back.
I just wanted to put them more to put them.
Yeah, so that's down below, that's down around the outlet down here. Yeah, I need a bigger board, that's what I need here, a bigger board and more colors. So, Ezekiel, we're going to talk about him next, and I'll use a different color for him. What would you guys like me to use? How about green? Green, okay, for Ezekiel? Okay, so Ezekiel's going to be green. Ezekiel came from a priestly line. We're going to see that. I haven't shown you that yet, but when we do today's passage here, and I'll do that in a little bit, you'll see that Ezekiel was from a priestly line. And he was studying for the priesthood in the temple, and he was taken captive to Babylon before he completed his studies. So that happened in 597 BC. First of all, Ezekiel was born up here in 622 BC, and he was taken captive in 597 BC in the second invasion of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. The Babylonians invaded Jerusalem the first time in 605. Then they went back, they changed kings at that time. They got rid of a king that was in there and put a new king in. Came back in 597 because the new king was kind of toying around with Egypt at that time. So they came back and conquered conquered Jerusalem again. And at that point, they brought more hostages out of Jerusalem. And Ezekiel went to Babylon and that second group of captives in 597 BC. And Ezekiel ultimately dies in about 570. So Ezekiel is, and Ezekiel gets his call from God, and that's where we're going to start next week. Gets his call from God in 593 BC, and we know the exact date, July 31st, 593 BC. Ezekiel is so precise, you're going to love it. He is so exact on how he does things. So Ezekiel gets his call from God in 593 BC, and so he's prophesizing for about 23 years in here, and he probably writes the book of Ezekiel just before he dies, and he had a secretary by the name of Baruch who helps him write the book. We're going to learn about that as we go through. Baruch was just his...
That's one of the non-canonical books too, first Baruch, second Baruch.
Yeah, I'm not teaching the book of Baruch here. That is not in the Bible.
I know.
I'm saying Baruch was his assistant. I'm teaching the book of Ezekiel, yes. So, the world around Ezekiel was changing in that period. And let's go through now what was happening in the world at large. And what was happening in the world at large, and I'm going to put that in a different color. Maybe we'll take this one in orange. How's that? What was happening in the world at large is, first of all, a major war began in 626 BC. Assyria had run the world for about 200 years. They were the superpower in the world. How they got there was interesting. They were the beginning of what was called the Iron Age. Before that, it was called the Bronze Age. If you look at Egypt, who was the big superpower before that, they made their weapons out of copper, bronze, which is the basis of bronze. And those were fine for that time. When Assyria came along, they decided to make their weapons out of iron. And guess what happened when you took an iron sword and hit a copper sword? It shattered, right? So all of a sudden, they were able to win battles very quickly. And Assyria conquered the whole known world at that point, including Egypt, by using iron. And it was called the Iron Age. And Assyria brought in the Iron Age. So you'll hear people talk about the Iron Age. And that began with Assyria. So Assyria, it was an incredibly brutal empire. It's hard to believe. I mean, they're probably right up there with ISIS that we saw a few years ago. Just kill them, murder them, cut their heads off. Just no mercy whatsoever. That was what the Assyrians were. The people hated them, but they were afraid of them. And so Assyria conquered the world during that period. And so that the war began in 626 BC. It continued for 14 years. In 612 BC, Assyria was defeated. Assyria was defeated by Babylon, Egypt, and the Medes. All three of them ganged up on Assyria at the same time. Babylon was the one that ultimately actually destroyed Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. So Babylon invaded and destroyed Nineveh in that period. By the way, Babylon and Nineveh are only about 100 miles apart.
Yep.
I mean, they're very close together. They're both in modern day Iraq.
Right.
So Babylon destroys Nineveh in 610 BC. And what happens then at the same time is while Babylon is pulling away from Assyria, Egypt also pulls away from Assyria. And Pharaoh Necho is the Pharaoh at that point in Egypt. And Pharaoh Necho decides to take over his part of the world. So he comes and attacks Judah.
Yep.
And a battle takes place in 610 BC where the good king Josiah of Judah dies. Josiah was the last good king of Judah. Josiah dies in 610 BC in a battle with Egypt, and Egypt takes over Judah. And that is the last time that Judah was really independent, was in 610 BC. That Israel was really independent until 1948. So for 2,500 years, Israel was not independent from that point, from the point where Pharaoh Necho killed Josiah until, they were first taken over by Egypt. Then, as we're going to see in a few years, they were taken over by Babylon. Babylon lost to Persia. Persia lost to Alexander the Great. Alexander lost to the Romans. The Romans lost to the Muslims, and basically, the Ottomans, the Turks, all these different people. And basically, Israel, Judah, was taken over and never became independent again until 1948. So this was a key point for Israel, or for Judah. Then another major battle occurred, even more important than any of these, was the battle in 605 BC. It was called the Battle of Carchemish. And what you had at this point was you had Babylon up here and Egypt down here that had both split up Assyria's empire, and they were at war with each other. And they eventually had this major battle. That's one of the most pivotal battles in history of the world at Carchemish, and Babylon defeats Egypt in that battle. And at that point, Egypt becomes part of the Babylonian Empire. So now Babylon has all of Assyria's empire. They own it all at this point. And Egypt is defeated for the first time after 3,000 years. Egypt was a world power. And Egypt is defeated. And Egypt has never really been a world power again since 605 BC. Sorry about that, Stephen.
I know that.
Sorry to have to mention that to you. But Egypt has never been a world power since 605 BC. It was just one of the great battles, one of the most important battles of the old world. Now, right after the king of Babylon defeats Egypt, as he's coming back, he makes a stop in Jerusalem and takes Jerusalem. And when he takes Jerusalem, he takes Daniel with him back to Babylon. He also takes the king with him back to Babylon, and a whole bunch of the royal household. And remember, Daniel was a noble, so Daniel went with him back to Babylon as a hostage. And the reason was the king wanted to make sure that Judah stayed loyal to him in the future. So the first captives go back to Babylon in 605 BC. Then in 597 BC, Judah is revolting against the king at that point. There's a new king in Judah who is revolting against Babylon. So Babylon comes back a second time and takes Jerusalem. And this time, they take the crown prince with them to Babylon. I'm sorry, they take the king with them. No, they take the crown prince with them to Babylon. No, they take the king to Babylon. I'm sorry, the crown prince takes over, becomes the new king. They take the king to Babylon. They take a second group of hostages to Babylon, and one of those is Ezekiel. So Ezekiel goes to Babylon in 597 BC. Now the interesting thing to notice here is Ezekiel was born in 622. He was a priest. He was of the priestly line, the line of Judah, the Kohen line, the Kohen part. Judah was the Levites, the Kohens were the priests. He was a Kohen, a priest. So he was of the priestly line of Judah, and he was about 25 years old when he was taken to Babylon. Now, if you recall, and have time to dive back through Leviticus on this. You can't be a priest until you're 30. You have to be 30 to start priestly duties in the temple. That was in there way back. God gave that to Moses. So he wasn't quite old enough to be a priest yet. So here he is. He's taken out of Jerusalem, where he spent 25 years studying to be a priest, and he goes to Babylon, where he's never going to be a priest because the temple's not in Babylon. And he doesn't realize it yet, but the temple's about to be destroyed. So he goes to Babylon, and then in 593 BC, he has his first vision. I'm going to talk about his visions in a few minutes. He has his first vision, and he is called, and God calls him. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the timing of this, it was just before his 30th birthday, right? He was born in 622, called in 593. So Ezekiel gets this calling from God that says, I really didn't want you to be a priest. I want you to be a prophet. And there's an important message in that for all of us. We don't know at what point in our lives God might give us a calling to do something to serve him. And it might be at a point where we totally don't expect it. At the age of 29, he was probably expecting, I'm going to be a priest at some point, and I'm studying for it. I'll keep studying for it until I get the chance. And then all of a sudden, boom, God comes along and makes him a prophet. Makes that determination in his lives. And many of us see that in our lives. We think our life is going to go this way, and all of a sudden God changes it, and it goes this way. And a lot of us have experienced that in various ways. Before 2011, it never dawned on me I could ever teach a Bible study. In 2011, my pastor said, I think you can teach a Bible study. I really have confidence that you can do it. 12 years later, I'm still teaching Bible studies. So it never dawned on me that I could do it. So God moves and I was 62 at the time, right? God moves in mysterious ways. He does things in times that we don't expect, and he does things we don't expect. It's true for all of us. I think if you talk to any pastor here, they'll give you a story like that. I'm sure I know Stephen can give you tons of stories like that. So Ezekiel's called in 593. He begins his ministry. I'll get into that in a few minutes. In 586, Jerusalem is destroyed by Babylon. Babylon comes back a third time in 586. The new king of Babylon at that point started messing around with Egypt again, trying to form a revolution of Egypt and Judah against Babylon. So the king came back in 586 BC, and this time he'd had enough. This was his third trip to discipline Judah, so this time he destroyed Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple, and he took the Jewish people, all of them, into exile, and the ones that didn't go into exile, either he killed them or he chased them off to Egypt. So there were basically no Jews left after that point. So that's that story, and then as we continue on, from there on, and the only other major thing that happened in 535 BC in world history was when Babylon fell. And at that point, the Jews were allowed to return by King Cyrus when Babylon fell. So that's what was going on in the world during this period. It was a very active period, a lot of big stuff. Major empires were changing dramatically during this period with battles and wars and all that stuff. Okay, that brings me to today's scripture. Today's scripture is Ezekiel 1 through 3. Let me read that to you. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I, that would be Ezekiel, was among the exiles by the Kiba River, that's in Babylon, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kiba River in the land of the Babylonians. The hand of the Lord was upon him. Okay, so that's what we're going to study today, is the beginning, the intro of the book. It says in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day. The 30th year here is different from the way it is everywhere else in the Bible. The second part of it, when he says on the 5th month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. That's typically how dates are given in the Bible. They're based upon the rule of the king. But the first part of it, in the 30th year, experts think that refers to his 30th year, that he was just coming up on 30 years old when this vision comes. So here he is, he's almost 30 years old, he's almost reached the point where he can be a full priest, and God gives him a vision that turns him into a prophet. So just before he was ready to become a priest, God turned him into a prophet with this vision. He gives us the specific date, the 4th month. This is the Hebrew calendar now. The 4th month of the Hebrew calendar and the 5th day. Excuse me. Now, before I go into actually interpreting all those words for you, let me just explain the structure of the book of Ezekiel. And it's structured differently from any other book in the Bible. Ezekiel had 13 visions from God in his life. Each time he had a vision, he wrote it down. He wrote it down. You can tell he wrote it down right after it got done. I mean, it is so detailed and so precise. He has the exact day that it happened on and the exact words that God gave him to give to the people. So he was a very precise guy, and you can tell he just wrote it down immediately as soon as the vision was done so that he wouldn't forget it. These 13 visions all occurred during this whole time frame here when Ezekiel was active as a prophet. So there are different times during that period. He had 13 visions from God. Nobody else anywhere in the Bible had 13 visions from God. John had 1 or 2, Paul had a couple, Peter had a couple, Daniel had several. I mean, Ezekiel had 1, Jeremiah had 1, I think, might have been 2. At any rate, nobody in the Bible had anything like 13 visions from God except Ezekiel. So Ezekiel is blessed in that respect. God specifically gave him visions 13 different times, and he recorded each one very carefully. I'm just going to briefly mention through those with you. The first one was Ezekiel's call, and that is the first 8 chapters of Ezekiel, and that was on July 31st of 593 BC. Again, the exact date. We know the exact date in today's dates that happened. The second was the vision of all the horrible things that were going on in Jerusalem, the idolatry, the sacrifice of children, all that stuff. That was 12 chapters of Ezekiel, chapters 8 through 19. That was September 17th, 592 BC. Then you had the deputation of the elders, which was 1 chapter, chapter 20, August 9th, 591 BC. Then the siege of Jerusalem begins, and it took 18 months for the Babylonians to besiege Jerusalem the final time. And that was dated, that was two chapters, and it was dated January 15th of 588 BC. And then an oracle against Tyre, Tyre, which was one of the local powers in that part of the world. It's in Lebanon today. And many people think Tyre is synonymous in this book with Satan. We'll talk about that when we get to that later. Some do, some don't. That was another 3 chapters, dated a little bit later in 586 BC. And then it backs up a little bit in time. Not all these are sequential, by the way. It goes back to 587 BC, January 7th. An oracle against Egypt is chapter 29. And then from Tyre to Egypt is another one, and that's 2 chapters in 571 BC. Then it talks about Pharaoh broke his arm. Interesting. That's a whole separate vision that he got about Pharaoh breaking his arm. We'll get into that one. It's kind of interesting. And that one was in 587 BC. That's Ezekiel 30. And then an oracle against Pharaoh. That was Ezekiel 31 in 587 BC. And then a lament when Pharaoh died. And that was in Ezekiel 31 and 32 in March of 585 BC. And then it talks about how the Pharaoh, and that would be the Pharaoh of Egypt, goes into Sheol, which is hell, in Ezekiel 32 through 33, and that's dated in 585 BC. And then we see the one where the city of Babylon actually falls, and that is at the beginning of 585 BC. It actually fell in 586 BC, but the communications were a little slower in those days, so this is January 8th of 585 BC. And that is 7 chapters. Those are the most famous chapters of Ezekiel. Those are the chapters that we're going to spend the most time on as we get into it. There's a lot in there. And then the vision of the New Jerusalem. And that was 9 chapters, 40 through 48. And it was dated just before he died in 573 BC. And this is the most detailed view of the New Jerusalem, of the millennial kingdom, that we're going to find anywhere in the Bible. It is in the final chapters of Ezekiel. It's a very, very beautiful part of the book. So as I said, the assumption that most biblical experts have made is that Ezekiel wrote down exact dates and messages immediately after he got the vision. That's the only way he could have ever gotten this level of detail recorded 20 years later. The exact date is in there. We know that he eventually compiled them into the book of Ezekiel later, probably around 570, just before he died, and later it will tell us that he used Baruch to do that. Baruch was his administrative assistant, whatever you want to call him, who kind of wrote the stuff down for him. So he had 13 visions, and that's it. Now, going back to verse 1 again. In verse 1, we saw that the first vision, as I said, occurred in his 30th year. It occurred, and remember, the temple in Jerusalem wasn't quite gone yet, but he knew he would never return to Jerusalem at that point, so he would never really become a priest. And he's probably wondering, hey, I'm almost 30, I've spent 30 years training to be a priest, what am I going to do with my life? And God says, you're going to be a prophet, right? Gives him a vision, you're going to be a prophet. And then God prepares him for that. He knew he couldn't begin his service, so he was excited. And there's a great lesson in that for us, that we saw it with the apostles as well. It's a great lesson that God will pull us out of what we think we're going to be doing and put us into something new, and we just need to go with that. The apostles did that. They were fishermen, and God pulled them out of that. They were tax collectors, and as I said, one of them was a revolutionary, and God pulled them out of that and put them into new careers for him. So it says that Ezekiel received the vision by the Kiba River in Babylon. Now, the river that runs through Babylon is the Euphrates River. It's a big river, huge river. But the Kiba River isn't really a river, it's a canal that the king of Babylon dug to go around Babylon to the east so he could put suburbs out there to the east and have water for them, have them be able to... Still there, is it? I did not know that. Okay. So the Kiba River goes to the east of Babylon, and the idea is the king wanted the suburbs to be able to have water, but he couldn't take all these people in the city of Babylon. There was just not enough room to get them all in there. So the suburbs were out to the east of Babylon by the Kiba River. Experts believe that when the Jews were taken into Jerusalem, and there was about 1 million Jews in Jerusalem at this point, when the Jews were taken into Jerusalem, that they were settled by the Kiba River. So that's why the thought process is that, Ezekiel says the vision came by the Kiba River. Presumably that was where the Jews were living at that point. Now I have an interesting historical point for you. They established a little city there, and they called the city Tel Aviv. Those of you that have been to Israel know that the biggest city in Israel today is called Tel Aviv. So when Israel was creating itself in 1948, or recreating itself, it took the new area that it was going to call this biggest city and called it Tel Aviv, after the city in Babylon that it once had. So the Kiba River, by the way, is mentioned 8 times in Ezekiel. It's referenced in some other places as well. At the end of the captivity, when I believe it was Haggai or was it Ezra, one of the two of them, as they were beginning to bring the people back, they talked about being by the river, by the Kiba River. So they were in Babylon for 70 years. And during that 70 years, they were really pretty comfortable there. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that Daniel was in with the king. They were pretty comfortable. They were allowed to own homes. They were allowed to own businesses. They were allowed to have money and keep money. They were allowed to worship their own God. And because Daniel and Ezekiel were there, they were worshiping the real God. Daniel and Ezekiel were leading them to worship God, not the pagan idols that they were worshiping back in Jerusalem. They were worshiping the real God. And they were allowed to do that in Babylon. So they were pretty comfortable in Babylon. And in fact, when the 70 years were up, a whole bunch of them didn't want to come back. They were so comfortable. Now, God wanted them to come back. That was the remnant that was coming back. So those that didn't come back were lost to history. They were comfortable. They intermarried with Babylonians, and over time they disappeared into wherever, into the melting pot of history. So the only ones who actually became part of Israel when they came back were the ones who actually came back. So the 5th day of the 4th month is from the Jewish calendar. And as I said, the fifth, and it's based upon the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. Interesting point there. King Jehoiachin was replaced in 597 BC by the Babylonians, by another king, King Zedekiah. And yet, what we see here is Ezekiel references not King Zedekiah's 5th year, but King Jehoiachin's 5th year of exile. So obviously he still revered King Jehoiachin as being the real king of Judah. That's an interesting point here, just the fact that he says it this way. So we know it's on the 4th Jewish month, on the 5th day. We can backtrack all of that today to July 31st of 593 BC. It's perfect. He gives us all this detail so that we today know the exact date this happened. Incredible to me. Yeah. In verse 3, it tells us that Ezekiel was a priest. We talked about that earlier. It also says that his father was either Boozy or Buzzy. I don't know how to pronounce that name. Boozy or Buzzy is never mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, so all we know about him is he was Ezekiel's father. That's the only thing we know about him. It goes on to say, the word of the Lord came to him, so he had a vision. That is his word for saying a vision. And then it says the hand of the Lord was upon him. So God didn't just give him a vision, he did something with Ezekiel in that vision. He changed Ezekiel in that vision. So those are the two things Ezekiel's telling us in that verse. Now, the book of Ezekiel explains in graphic detail all the different sins that Judah committed. And we're going to go through some of that. A lot of it is repetitive, and as we go through it, we will I'll talk to you a little bit about how we're going to cover that piece. But they were going to get punished if they didn't repent. It lays out in graphic detail what actually did or will happen to them if they don't repent. It lays out in graphic detail what's going to happen to all of Judah's neighbors. And the Babylonians are going to do this at first, and it lays that out. And it also lays out in graphic detail what will happen at the tribulation to Judah's neighbors or Israel's neighbors. We're going to talk about that. So there's something very long-term prophetic here. It's more than just prophetic about the next few years. Ezekiel is also long-term prophetic, especially as we get to the end of the book. He's very long-term prophetic about what's going to happen. And it also lays out beyond the tribulation what will happen in the millennial kingdom. And it's the most detailed description of the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign, that we find anywhere in the entire Bible. We have 9 chapters that are all about detail about the millennial kingdom. So when we get there, we're going to see tons of detail about how that 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth is going to work. Now, something we're going to start studying next week is the glory of God. Ezekiel spends a lot of time on the glory of God. His first vision is about the glory of God. And we're going to learn a lot about the glory of God. The first 11 chapters have a lot to do with the glory of God. And then at the very end, in the very end of the book, he comes back to the glory of God. The glory of God leaves Jerusalem, but then it comes back with Jesus in the millennial kingdom. He uses a bunch of phrases. He uses the phrase, and these are going to get pretty repetitive as we go through them. He says, then they will know that I am the Lord. This is God speaking this to him in his visions. God says that to him 40 times in this book. Okay, so we're going to get a little repetitive on a few things. Some other phrases we're going to see Ezekiel say. Ezekiel says, the word of the Lord came. So this is how Ezekiel is explaining to us how he's getting these visions from the Lord. He uses that 62 times. So again, it's going to get a little repetitive as we go through some of this. Then it says, the hand of the Lord was upon him. That's Ezekiel. So God wanted Ezekiel to do something 26 times in the book of Ezekiel. And then the last one, my favorite, is Ezekiel is called Son of Man. God calls him Son of Man. That's how he addresses Ezekiel 93 times. Now, they're a bit repetitive. Let me just say before I move off the term Son of Man appears someplace else in the Bible, right? Somebody else uses Son of Man, right? Jesus uses Son of Man to describe himself. We're going to talk as we get on into that about how God's use of Son of Man is different than Jesus' own use of Son of Man to describe himself. You might think, well, gosh, they're just calling themselves the same thing, but they aren't. It's a different time, it's 600 years apart, and they have a different meaning at that time than they do when Jesus uses it 600 years later. So lastly, I wanted to talk about the structure. We've talked about the structure, 13 visions. It's a very long book. It's 48 chapters. It's 45 pages in my Bible. That's a lot. Revelation was about 12 pages, and it took me 74 classes. So you're probably saying, how is he ever going to get through this, right? And the answer is, I'll be teaching this differently than I did in Revelation. It'll be a lot less detailed than what we did in Revelation. There is a lot of repetition in here. And I've been thinking a whole lot about how to do that. And right now my current plan, and this might change as we get into it, my current plan is to read you the entire section that we're going to do that day, but to only focus on the verses that are significant and that aren't repetitive. That's my current plan. If that works, we'll see, but that's my current plan of how we're going to get through this in a reasonable period of time, rather than spending the next 20 years of our lives studying the book of Ezekiel. So it's going to be a faster pace, and I'll work on that. By the way, it's 1,300 verses in Ezekiel. It was 305 in Revelation, to put that in perspective for you. It's a lot bigger book than Revelation was. And next week we're going to look at the glory of God, which is the first vision that comes, and this is the famous vision of God coming in on his chariot with the creatures pulling the chariot, and it's a vision. It's interesting, if you ask a Jewish rabbi what is the most difficult part of the Bible to understand, almost every one of them will say the first chapter of Ezekiel. It's very, very difficult, and part of it is they don't have Jesus. If they had Jesus, it would be a little easier to understand. But if you ask Jewish rabbis, most of them will say that's the toughest chapter in the Bible to understand, and we're going to start understanding it next week. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you're joining us at home, let me just let you know that you can find us on Facebook at the Lifeway Wesleyan Church Facebook site, and you can find us on YouTube at the Lifeway Wesleyan Church YouTube site. Both my classes are up video on both of those. In addition to that, you can download the notes on both of those. The notes are notes that the class has every day when they come in here live, but you can download them as well and use the notes. And if you don't have the notes and you want them, just call the church. We keep extra copies here, and we'll be happy to send them to you. So thank you at home for joining us, and thank you everyone here for joining us. And we'll see you next week.